Compromise of 1877 as a result of the election of 1876. This is the election, remember, that you have Hayes, the Republican, Tilden, the Democrat. There are 20 electoral votes that are disputed. Hayes needs all 20 in order to become president. Tilden needs 1. Or Hayes maybe needs 19. Anyway, 19 or 20. Congress appoints a committee to decide who gets the votes, all or some or whatever, to divide them up. It originally has 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, 1 independent. Then the independent gets a job back home. So a Republican is appointed and they award all 20 votes to Hayes. He knows for Congress to accept this committee's findings and him to become president, he's got to make an agreement with Southerners. That's the Compromise of 1877, an agreement with Southern politicians. The agreement is that there will be a Southerner put in the cabinet, that the United States government will build the Southern Pacific Railroad, that Southerners will control all patronage jobs in their states, and most important, home rule. The troops will be taken out of the South, and another name for home rule is redemption. Okay? The white old class of Bourbons will rule again in the South. The good old boy politicians. What did Hayes' elections end? It ended Reconstruction. Okay? All right, the Indians and the West. The relationship of Indians and whites between 1861 and 1890, cruddy, more cruddy, and cruddiest, okay? We were busy chasing the Indians around the Great Plains, trying to put them into reservations. They were busy trying to fight off the Army from doing this. There are actually more soldiers killed than Indians in this 30-year period of time, but ultimately the Indians are rounded up and put on reservations. The Dawes Severalty Act. Sorry, we had to temporarily chastise a student. Okay, the Dawes Severalty Act did what? It limited tribal authority. Tried to take away Indian lands held as a whole and make it into individual holdings. The Dawes Act said you, as Mr. Native American, get 160 acres. You live on it and work the land for 25 years, and you then own it, and you can become a citizen of the United States. If you were Mr. White Boy from Sweden coming to America and you were homesteading in Nebraska in this same period of time, how long did you have to live on your land and improve it before it became yours? 5 years. That's what the Homestead Act said, 5 years. So because you're Mr. Native American, it's 25 years. The effect of the Dawes Act is it somewhat limited tribal authority, but Indians still continue to go with leadership collectively versus individually. Go stands Wavoka, or that should be Wavoka. The C and V should be transposed. Wavoka was like a spirit that the Indians danced to. The Army forbid the ghost dance being performed because they said it created a rebellion. It led to Wounded Knee. Eventually the Indians couldn't hold out any longer, and they came to Wounded Knee to give up, and the Army massacred them because they thought they were coming in to rebel, and they weren't. Indians of the Plains, their lifestyle, well, they traveled around going after the buffalo. And a couple of things happen. One, the government decides to round them up and put them on reservations, which causes a lot of war between the two. And also there's the problem that as trains and settlers moved into the Great Plains, they wanted the Indians constrained because, and the buffalo gone also, because buffalo go through barbed wire very easily. And they stopped trains for hours. So they hired, the railroad companies hired people like Buffalo Bill Cody, who shot 4,000 buffalo in a year. And so the lifestyle of the Plains Indians began to change dramatically when there weren't buffalo to go after. Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand, whatever you want to call it. It's where the Indians trapped Custer in a dead-end box canyon, whatever you call it. If you ever go there, it's not very deep-sighted, so it makes you wonder what a stupid fool Custer was that he couldn't see thousands of Indians up on top waiting, but whatever. Americans talk about this massacre, and was it a massacre? You bet. Was it? But it was really Custer's stupidity, not because the Indians tricked them or anything. But the Indians really suffered because of their win here, because the Army really stepped up its in fort trying to round them up and put them on reservations. What militarily survived the Battle of Little Bighorn? Yeah, one horse. Helen Hunt Jackson wrote a book called The Century of Dishonor, where she said, A, that the government should help Indians set up industries, B, they should punish Indians for the defeat of Custer, or C, she suggested that the U.S. government had not acted honorably towards Indians. C. Okay. She was really big on the government not acting honorably, though she was really for acculturation of Indians, making sure that Indians were Christianized and civilized. She supported Indian boarding schools to teach Indians to, quote, walk in white men's shoes, that kind of thing. What book outlined the mistreatment of Indians? Century of Dishonor, The Jungle, The Octopus, Main Street. The answer, of course, is Century of Dishonor. The Jungle was the book about meatpacking plant and immigrants. The Octopus about the horrors of what industry? The railroads. Okay, the Octopus was a bunch of railroad companies. Main Street is a 1920s book which pokes fun at the middle class America. Okay. Settlement to the west was a pattern, not a straight line. What they were getting at is once 1860-ish came, there's a pattern to settlement, but it tends to follow the gold rush. So people went from settling to the Missouri River to jumping to California and then coming back to Colorado, then going to Idaho, then going back to South Dakota, okay, kind of back and forth. North and south, the same thing. People settled in Texas, and then they drove cattle up to Kansas, so eventually they settled in Kansas along the railroad lines, etc. So there was a pattern. It wasn't just necessarily a straight line. Women's suffrage in the West. Remember that in 1869, Wyoming becomes the first state to give women the right to vote. Why do they do this? A couple of reasons. One, they want to encourage women's settlement in the West, and two, they want to give them kudos for settling in the West and helping build the West. Okay? Homesteads were much more successful when there was a woman in the sod house cooking and cleaning. Okay, Susan B. Anthony supported women's suffrage. If you think about antebellum America feminist movement, we're talking Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who wanted legal rights for women and secondarily a right to vote. They get those legal rights in most states, so by the late 1800s, women are really pushing for the right to vote, which is suffrage, and that's Susan B. Anthony. Okay? Turner's thesis. Frederick Jackson Turner was an historian from Harvard, or excuse me, the University of Wisconsin most of the time, and Harvard, but who wrote something called Turner's Thesis, which talked about the importance of the frontier to America. That from the frontier, it provided a safety valve for people. The frontier was a big supporter of democracy, individual rights. At the same time, the idea of a sense of community, so that if Matthew's barn burns down, we just don't say, oh, poor Matthew. We all gather at Matthew's farm on Saturday, and we build Matthew a new barn. Okay? That's part of the greatness of the frontier, according to Turner.